All right, we're now recording, and this is Monday, April 6th. Hopefully, everyone who is watching this video has had a good Easter break, relaxing, get recharged, maybe enjoy the fact that you may have gotten the opportunity to see some of your family members you don't normally see because of your Easter celebrations. So here we are back in chapter 11. In my opinion, chapter 11 is not um, a real heavy chapter. It's basically discussing the changing roles of adulthood after emerging adulthood, which, as we talked about last week, is considered to be over when you're 30. So this is the post 30 discussion, and what it's mostly focused on is marriage, and even if it's not marriage, it's relationships, committed relationships. That's what this chapter is devoted to. In fact, I highlighted this. This chapter is devoted to the main social changes involved in being adult. So the only thing that differentiates emerging people in emerging adulthood is just people that are in adulthood that are gone through emerging adulthood. Now, remember when Erickson created his original steps of development, he started out from 18 years old to 40 years old as early adulthood. And like I said, that's 22 years of lifespan. So when you add the new emerging adulthood, which is 18 to 30, then you split up that 22 into that 12-year group of emerging adulthood, and then 30 to 40, which would be the end of the traditional Erickson's description of early adulthood. So this is kind of like a discussion of early adulthood beyond emerging adulthood. So the only thing they can focus on is relationships, because everything else has already been dealt with in emerging adulthood. So let's take a historical perspective here about the history, at least in the United States, about marriages. And the author says, throughout most of history, as I described in chapter 1, life was short and harsh. Marriages were practical arrangements designed to cement family, friendships, relationships, not fulfill a couple's inner needs. In fact, the typical marriage used to last only a decade or two before a partner died. And that sounds horrible, but that's the way it was in the 1800s. That's why people were getting married when they were 13 and 14, because they might not live but another 20 years, which would only put them in their 30s, because most people didn't live beyond 40 years of age. So it was sort of more of a business decision. You have to get married and you have to have kids to carry on the farm work and need and have the support while you're alive to be able to survive, because you and your children can work the land and do the things that you have to do. Why is my microphone in the picture again? Okay, no more microphone. Well, this was in the 1800s. In the early 1900s, we talked about the fact the Industrial Revolution occurred in the United States. People were moving from the country into the cities, and that's how we got at the advent of adolescence, and it changed the whole way families were defined. Then, with the advances of health, advances in medicine, people were living longer. So she mentions health advances of the early 20th century, which is the 1900s. Western nations developed the idea that people should get married in their 20s and be lovers for a half a century or more. So you could wait to get married until you were 18 or 19 or 20 and still have a good 30, 40, maybe even 50, depending on what part of the 20th century you're talking about, more years of life. And that does change the price of poker, because if you're going to die probably in your 40s or even before your 40s, and now you're not going to die until you're in your 60s, maybe even in the 70s, that changes the whole idea about how long you're going to be together as husband and wife, and what you can do and what you wouldn't be able to do in prior times. So, not to mention the fact that people were not just working farms anymore and ranches as they were in the 1800s. So that's a big change. After World War II, which many people don't think about this, but a lot of people got killed in World War II. A lot of eligible men, I mean, between the ages of 18, sometimes even earlier, 18 to 40, were sapped up into the war and killed. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people were killed in World War II. And that changed the complexion of marriages as well. That is best evidenced by the fact of what people like me, who are called baby boomers, we are products of marriages that occurred for the most part after 1945, and a bunch of people got married and a bunch of people started having children. And there's a whole huge group of us from about 1945 to, I think they say maybe 65 or something, 1965. That group is called baby boomers, and there's a lot of us in it. And that is a direct result of the tragedies of war and the first time in the United States since the Civil War that people actually experienced a huge portion of our population of being killed. And there was a sense of optimism after the victory, and there was a need to get the country back on its feet. A lot of the women who had carried on the industrial jobs and construction jobs that they never would have had but for the fact that the war had all the men sucked up doing that. That changed everything as well. Some women remained in the workforce. Others said, hell no, I'm I'm out of this job. Well, I want to go back to being a traditional wife and having children in the home. So things changed dramatically in that time. And then she mentions the last third of the 20th century, which was not that long ago. Western ideas about marriage took another turn. The women's movement, this is after 1964, of course. The women's movement told us that women should have careers and their spouses should take share in the child care responsibility. As a result of the 1960s lifestyle revolution, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, um, that people should stay. We rejected the idea that people should stay in an unhappy marriage. The 60s, of course, were a big social revolution. And one thing the author doesn't mention, but she should have, is birth control. Wow. Pastillas, pills, birth control pills became available. And that changed the whole concept of marriage as well, because the old school was, in order for you to be having sex, you needed to be married. And if you're having sex and you are married, then there's a high likelihood that children are going to follow, even though there were other types of birth control around. The most popular, of course, is the pill, which came around at that time as well. And then the other thing that changed tremendously is no fault divorce. Before the war, it was hard in most of the 50 states to get a divorce. It has to be a reason for a divorce, and the fact that you guys didn't like each other and weren't getting along was not sufficient. You had to argue something else. And so what often happened is somebody would, whether it was true or not, would argue infidelity in the marriage, which means you're having sex with somebody outside the marriage. And that was a valid reason to get divorced. So people who wanted to get divorced, but were not having sex outside their marriage, they would lie and say, yeah, I had an affair. And that's the end of it. So when no fault divorce came around, which was a product of the 60s, no fault meaning you don't have to find fault. You just get two people together and say, we don't want to be married anymore. And the courts can say, okay, makes sense to us. And you get a divorce. So birth control and no fault divorce radically changed the concept of marriage. And of course, the 60s, was about experimentation and communal living and multiple sex partners, free love, and all that kind of stuff. That was just a tremendous cultural change from our entire history in the United States. Now, the book also mentions this concept of serial cohabitation. In other words, serial meaning one after another after another. Cohabitation means living together without being married. So, and this happens today, this is still going on, where people don't get married, they live together for a certain amount of time, and then there's conflicts and they move out and move on, and then they end up in another hooked up relationship and live with that person for a number of time. That's what the author is making the comment about serial cohabitation. Therefore, you are paired up with somebody, but you're not married. Whether you're having kids or not is up in the air. And the one thing that is true is you're not committed for a forever relationship by consummating a marriage in that relationship. Now, one thing the author does not talk about is a concept of there are some people in the United States, which to me makes some sense, that at one time in the United States, we used to be able to have more than one wife. Now, why somebody would do that, I don't know. One wife is a challenge enough. I don't know why you would want three. But for instance, the Mormon religion gets tagged with this because they were at one time really big in this multiple wife thing. Not multiple husbands, multiple wives. And again, that had something to do with the religion accepting it, but it also had to do with the fact that people were living off the land, even though the Industrial Revolution had occurred. A lot of Mormons were out in Utah and other areas that were kind of rugged out in the West. So, with more than one wife, there was more people in the family to kind of keep things going. And with more than one wife, you can have a lot of kids, and sometimes that's what happened. So there's some people that, and of course, polygamy is what that's called, polygamy. Polygamy is outlawed. You cannot legally be polygamous now. And some people have argued that we are still polygamous, one wife at a time or one relationship at a time. In other words, men, usually it's us, they get bored with one partner. Instead of having 2 or 3 partners in the family, which would be polygamous, we have one partner, and then that relationship's over, and then we go into another one and have another serial cohabitation. But in reality, you're having the equivalent of polygamy, one wife at a time. So I thought I would mention that because there does seem to be something about that. And it seems to be more male driven than female driven. If you go back to the basic biology of women having a certain amount of eggs upon birth and men having a limitless amount of sexual gametes, cells, sperm, whatever you want to call it, sperm cells as opposed to egg cells that create life. From a historical evolutionary point of view, men have always been the one on the prowl to spread their seed out so that the humanity can continue to live and not go extinct, where women have a set amount of eggs and they can't get any more, although they always have plenty. But the idea is that women are more selective when they choose a mate, where men are more interested in having a lot of mates than just one quality mate. So that biological reason has been reinforced by social behavior as well. So I'll throw that in. Now, here's a great quote. In recent years, because only 11% of US women without a college degree are married before giving birth. So if you don't have a degree and you are pregnant, there's a higher amount of people who are not married. So in other words, those who are having these children and they don't have a degree, very few of them are married. You might ask yourself, why is that? Well, it would seem, I mean, if almost 90% of them are unmarried, it would seem that people who have a degree, not because they're smarter, but because they have a different focus in their life, they are holding off getting married and having children in this emerging adulthood because they are focused on something greater than just starting a family and getting married. It's not about intelligence. It's about what you're committed to do. She mentions arranged marriages. I think most people know that India is the country that is doing the most arranged marriages, which sounds really odd to us as being rugged individualists in the Western society, but in their society, it's more commonplace. So some of the Muslim countries, arranged marriages frequently occur. And unfortunately, there's polygamy going on in the some Arab countries, and children are being married. It's always males that get to marry somebody much younger than them. And that's going on in other countries. Thankfully, not here. The Middle East, male-dominated marriages. Well, yeah, they're still living in the 16th, 17th century. Their thinking is, women are property, just like the cows and the horses in the stables, And there's a picture of here of a woman driving a car in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia in 2018 allowed women to drive. Can you imagine that? 2018? And that's only Saudi Arabia. All the rest of the countries are still behind Saudi Arabia in liberating married or not married, women. So women are subjugated in these countries big time. And their religion supports that, their customs support that. In human sexuality, we talk about female genital mutilation. That's about the only place in the world that's practiced is in that Mediterranean Sea area, northern Africa, and southern Mediterranean, which is it's not necessarily a religious tradition. It's not a Muslim tradition, but it is a cultural decision in many of the countries that its practice are Muslim in nature, but it's not a religious decision. It seems to be based in old school practices that have carried on and unfortunately still going on today. So here's the $50,000 question. Is being married better than living single? Hundreds of US comparisons suggest the answer is yes. So she lists a bunch of married couples seem to be happier, they seem to be wealthier, they seem to be healthier. Well, that makes sense because you're working as a team, you're taking your assets together, pooling your assets to have a family or at least marriage. And that is economically advantageous. And if you have a loved one that you live with, that's psychologically can be very happy, create happiness and joy and stability in your life, where living alone or bouncing around from one boyfriend or girlfriend, that's not much stability involved in that. And since we're beyond emerging adulthood, where that was a big issue, people bouncing around, checking their own selves out, checking out what they really want to do in life. Well, now that we're beyond that, we're getting more into stable decision making. So, all right, the next thing that she talks about is Sternberg's triangular theory of love. And that is a very interesting concept. We talked about Robert Sternberg before. And this has to do with the three corners of this triangle being intimacy, passion, and commitment, and different portions of that. I posted a diagram on that. There's a diagram in the book, of course. And I'm going to see if I can play this video. I hope I can play this. Let me know, Amber, if this is going to work. I always wonder. Can you see that?
I cannot.
You cannot see it right now? Okay, I've got to do something different then. Let's see. How about share screen? There we go. Well, he says. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I forgot to do that step. Okay, tell me if the volume is not good. Maybe I should just automatically crank it up, and then you can crank it down if it's not loud enough. This is a interview with Andrea Tantaros, who used to be with Fox News. She had her own program called Trending with Tantaros. She was big in the talking heads, not only on her program, but also other programs on Fox, probably for two reasons. One is she is very attractive, and two, she's very smart. So she was a typical hiree of Roger Ailes, who used to run Fox News or Fox program, and I'm going to talk about the two of them after this video. And she's interviewing a woman called Melanie Notkin, who wrote a book called Otherhood, sort of a play on motherhood without the M, so it's Otherhood. And this discussion is just really hits home about the stage of marriage today. This is a little bit older video, but still it describes what's going on today. So let's listen to this. It's only 6 minutes long.
Well, you may be familiar with The Single Girl. Many of us watch.
Can you hear that all right?
On Sex and the City.
Yes.
But more women in real life are staying single. So why is that? Welcome to Trending. I'm Andrea Tantaros. Joining me is Melanie Notkin, author of Otherhood, which is a book that's sweeping the nation. And a lot of women are racing out and they're buying this book because it's resonating with them, Melanie. Why are so many women staying single more than ever before? Because we won't settle for a lesser love, because we want the right relationship, and we're waiting for that right relationship before even becoming mothers. So we now have the financial security and all of the education and the independence as modern women to wait for the right love, and we won't settle for less. And you also say that women are waiting to have kids. So there's a lot of women staying single, but there's also women who are not having children. And that is because they're waiting for the right partner. They don't want to go at it alone. They don't want to be the Murphy Brown and run out and try and be a single mother. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about what's wrong with the guys, because we were talking earlier. What is prompting all of these single women looking for love? It seems to be maybe an issue on the other side of the gender aisle.
I think it's an issue on both sides. And then I think the feminism, the movement was wonderful, and we have so much to be grateful for. However, I think it became a little confusing for Generation X, and that here we are, these modern, independent women, and we were told, well, in order to be equal to men, we had to be more like men, and started to literally meet them in the middle for a date. And the men were like, well, I don't want to be called a chauvinist pig, so I'm going to lean back and I'll let her pick the restaurant, and I'll let her take charge. And meanwhile, well, that dynamic doesn't necessarily work for a lot of women. We want a man who's going to pick that restaurant, be a little chivalrous, a lot chivalrous on that date. And that was the number one complaint I got from women, no matter how well educated they were, how financially secure they were. Really, bottom line, with all the women I interviewed, pick the restaurant.
So, okay, have we become too potent, or are they just not stepping up?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that women, powerful women, have to know the power in our femininity, which means sometimes to lean back and to let him plan the day, to give him permission to be the man that he enjoys to be. And men have gotten a little lazy. And I spoke to some matchmakers and I talked about it in the book. Like, you've got to be able to make sure that you plan the day, you be decisive, be thoughtful. Don't say, yeah, come to the restaurant right near my business place when it's pouring rain. So I think it's a little bit of both. Women have to learn, as we know, to lean in at work, but lean back at night, and vice versa for men.
Okay. So look at these statistics that we have from your book here. Non-moms in America, let's look at that one first. 80% say they could lead a happy life without kids. 47% of women childbearing age aren't mothers. Okay, 80% of women say they could lead a happy life without kids. And also 46 want kids, 36% don't want kids, 18 are on the fence. What's the reason? Let's take the first poll we looked at first. Say they could lead a happy life without kids. Yep. That has dramatically changed over the decades. Are women just resigning themselves to, hey, look, I have a great career, I've got the money. If it doesn't happen for me, I'm at peace with it. I'm not going to settle.
So these are statistics that came out of a study called Shades of Motherhood I worked on with DeVries Global PR. We looked at 2,000 women, 1,000 moms, 1,000 non-moms. And what we found was, yes, indeed, that while women may not have children, some by circumstance like myself, I've always wanted to find love, get married, and have children, some by choice. Most of us find a way to be happy. Nonetheless, we are not these sad sack women with, well, there was nothing wrong with cats. I once had a cat myself with 12 cats waiting for some Prince Charming we read about when we were 3 years old. We are capable, modern women who find other ways, find new ways to find happiness. And by the way, the numbers actually haven't changed. We've just gotten more attention on the idea of child-free. In fact, there was a Gallup poll that came out in September that was the same numbers as the same Gallup poll from 1990 that said the same number of men and women of childbearing age, through age 40 they looked at, want children. Only 5% of adults are child-free by choice. And I completely champion and defend that choice. However, I don't know that necessarily the numbers or the reaction to whether or not one wants to be a parent has changed.
Well, I'm thinking back to maybe the 40s, the 50s, or the 60s, when women felt like they didn't have the option. These numbers have changed since then. I mean, women feel like they have a lot of options. In fact, I think the complaint is they have too many. They're overwhelmed. They have too many responsibilities. Like, thanks, feminism, for all this responsibility. But now I'm just so busy, I don't have time for everything else.
Well, that's true to some degree, meaning there's no question. 1976, women who were childless was 35%. In 2010, the latest U.S. Census data we saw right there was 47%. And that doesn't include women like me. I just turned 45 and I'm childless. And so there are definitely more women who become mothers later, or unfortunately are not mothers by the time they end their fertility. However, yes, we have a lot of choices, but the best choice, which feminism gave us, was to wait for love. And of course, they became mothers once they got married. But why did they become married? Because they had a roof over
waited
their head.
or love. And you know what? Maybe if they did wait for the right one, instead of feeling the pressure, maybe the divorce rate would go down. So if women just leaned into work, leaned back a little bit, men stepped it up.
Yep.
If women let them be men again, but men stepped it up and they waited for the right person, maybe this could solve this problem.
Andrew, you're right. The studies show that actually women who marry at 35 later actually have healthier, longer marriages.
I'm going to take that to the bank.
Me
That
too.
made me feel so much better.
Oh, good.
Melanie Notkin, author of Otherhood, fantastic book. Make sure to check it out. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Andrea.
And thank you for
Okay, Otherhood. This video is from 2015, so that's 6 years ago. And Notkin's idea is that women do have more choices because of the feminist revolution in the 60s and on into the 70s. The roles of women were opened up as far as not having to get married to feel fulfilled, and more women being in the professional life, working and not getting married and having children, because that's sometimes halts your career development if you're taking off to nurture your child after they're born, or even before they're born, during pregnancy, and all sorts of things can occur when you drop yourself out of the workforce when you're, let's say, in your 30s, and you're rising up right at critical times. If you drop out of the workforce, that can affect your professional growth after you come back into the workforce. And that's an issue that women became aware of, deciding not to get married or having kids, extending it beyond emerging adulthood. She mentions Murphy Brown. You guys are too young to remember. Murphy Brown was a TV program that was about professional women. And Murphy Brown decides that she is going to have a kid, and she's not married. And it was, oh my gosh, it was, a social uproar. It even got involved in presidential politics when the senior George Bush was running for president, and he chose now I can't remember his name, his vice president from Indiana. It was a young guy. He got into a debate with he's a Republican, of course. He got into debate with the Democrat, and one of the things he brought up was that his party stood for something other than what Murphy Brown stood for, which was women having babies outside of marriage. And so it was a big social uproar. Today, of course, it's nothing, but then it was a big deal. Now, the idea that feminism had empowered women to do things that society wasn't allowing them to do before is absolutely true. And so women were getting into the workforce. They were demanding equal pay for equal work, which still is sometimes is not the case. And the other thing I think about, because when I first watched this, I've used this video for literally since 2015. So Melanie, who is 45 in 2015, says, I'm looking for the wonderful man, and I am wanting to have children in this idyllic concept of marriage that I've thought about. I posted another video of hers on Blackboard, which is, it's longer and it goes more into her personally. It's a TEDx video. And she talks about the fact that she'd always rehearsed getting married as a child. She was, you know, going through with her dolls and her, all these kinds of things. The concept of marriage has been on her mind since childhood. And in this video, she says, you know, I'm still looking for the Mr. Right and hope to have children. And I teach human sexuality, and I've been around a little bit, and I'm saying, Melanie, you're 45 years old. You've never had a child. Guess what? You're not going to have a child. Even if you marry tomorrow and start having sex unprotected, it's very likely you're not going to have a child. And some people would say, oh, well, Melanie, you're just too picky. Well, I mean, why marry somebody that you're not 100% committed to? And if you're not 100% happy with the person that you're with, then don't marry him. And that's her position. Well, guess what? She's now 51 years old. She's not going, well, she hasn't been married yet, and she certainly is not going to have any children unless she adopts them or inherits them from her husband. So the idea, the virtuous idea of waiting until the right man comes along, there's nothing wrong with that idea. Like I said, why would you want to marry somebody that's not the right fit for you? And she goes on a little bit more on the other video about dating and how she's happier now just dating than when she was dating when she was in her 30s. And so it's a very interesting way of looking at things, but the overall concept is you have more choices. You're not, it's socially acceptable now to have children outside of marriage. And just because you have a child with somebody does not mean that you have to marry them or even have a long-term relationship with them. So many people in today's world are having children sometimes by accident, by not taking precautions, and then they end up being a single parent. That happens a lot in Southwest United States and Mexico, and happens a lot in the Philippines too. Very conservative cultures, very Catholic cultures, but still people are having kids outside of marriage because of the loosened attitudes about that. Used to be, if you got pregnant, let's say you're 18 or something, you get pregnant, you're not married, people used to ship you away to a relative in Minneapolis or something, because the pressure was so great on the community that if your daughter was pregnant, she was, 17, 18, whatever, it would be such a negative thing that you were so embarrassed you would ship her off. Hi, Melanie. You would ship her off so you would have to bear the shame, or she would have to bear the shame of being a single parent. Now that doesn't happen anymore, but it did happen. That's how much community attitudes pressured a family. That is not an issue today. A lot of folks, maybe even some of you, have children, you're not married, and you're living in your parents' household. It's not that unusual. It's a very common issue. And, like I say, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, you might have gotten another kind of reception when that happened. So things have certainly changed about marriage in that area. There's a really kind of interesting little section here where she's talking about marriages and communication styles and whether people are happy or not. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 things she talks about.
Well, it helps when you go to class at the right time.
Hi, Melanie.
Oh, hour difference.
Okay. Number 1, happy couples engage in a high ratio of positive to negative comments. So in their communication style, if you measure these things like these couples were watched, they found out that certainly some negative things are going to happen, but if the positive things are greatly outweighing the negative things, then that is a pretty good indicator that this marriage can last. It's like a negative thing pops up, but yet the partners work at reestablishing positive communication and positive feelings about each other. So it sort of dilutes the negativity of something that happened, an argument, or obviously we always know that when you get into a disagreement with your partner, you're better off staying away from any kind of personal attacks. Stick with the facts and try to work them out, and it's going to be a better result. Many of us resort to name calling and shaming and all that kind of stuff. That's a recipe for divorce or separation if you're not married. Happy couples don't get personal when they disagree. That's the next part I just was talking about. Don't make it personal. If you say, well, I said this, you said this, keep it on the factual basis, not on the personal, stick the knife in and twist it because you're heading for disaster. Number 3, happy couples are sensitive to a partner's need for space. Understand your partner well enough to know that they want a little separation time, or when you need to give your partner some alone time. You can check it out, want me just leave you alone, or I'll go do something, I'll come back and we'll re-engage on this conversation when we have a different feeling about our tempers are down. Or even if it's not an argument, just understand that I need time alone, or I need time with work or some other issue outside our relationship. Not that I'm with some other woman or man, but understand that you can't smother somebody and be on them all the time. And then number 4, happy couples listen non-defensively to complaints. That is a communication style. If you've ever been to any kind of training on communication styles, you learn things like make I statements. In other words, make statements about me, not statements about you. So somebody comes home and they're stressed from work. So instead of saying, you always come home and you're in a bad mood, and then you carry your bad mood into us, and then we have a fight, and all that kind of stuff. That's not good. That's accusatory. That's not making any I statements. So just a simple way of describing what happens, like, look, I really feel shut out of our lives together because I think the stresses from work, um, when you do come home, I feel like I should leave you alone because you're upset and we can't talk because you're, you know, and I miss our opportunities to talk, and I'm certainly willing to listen to whatever is on your mind, and maybe we can clear the air because I miss you when you're not here all day, and then when you come home, I still can't engage you because of things that have happened at work. So I miss that, and I would like that to change. Something like that. It's the same factual situation, but you're owning your own feelings and talking about your needs rather than pointing the finger and being accusatory. And that just doesn't help with the relationship in general. So if you were a therapist and you're dealing with couples, like in couples therapy or marriage therapy, marriage counseling, a lot of your time as a therapist is devoted to improving the two people's communication styles. Because when you're upset, angry, you don't always express your thoughts clearly. The person hearing them doesn't always hear it the way you really meant things to say. A lot of miscommunication occurs when there's heavy emotion in the air. So you have to take a step back, go back to the principles of making I statements and checking out with your partner what they really meant, and you saying what you really want, and not be so accusatory and not be demeaning, obviously, of your partner. So these are skills that can be taught. A lot, like I said, a lot of marriage therapy is about communication styles. So, all right. There's a good discussion about remarriages after a first marriage failure and whether that works or doesn't work. It seems that remarriages after the first statistically seem to have better communication skills the second time around or third time around, probably because you've already been divorced once, maybe twice, and you know that process, and you know you don't have to live with somebody if you're really unhappy. So maybe the next time you get married after your first marriage, which for many of us were your idealistic idea that this was going to be the marriage for life, that's what you made the commitment to in your marriage ceremonies, and then it didn't happen. So you don't want that to repeat itself. So there's some lessons learned. On the other hand, second or third marriages can mean maybe there's stepchildren involved. Maybe there's a necessity of a person having to contact their ex-wife or ex-husband because of the children, and it's more complicated. So it doesn't mean that it's doomed to failure, but it does become more complicated, especially if children are involved. So I'm going to stop this discussion for today on this idea that if you look statistically at second and third marriages, what happens? As I said, remarried couples face unique barriers. These spouses seem less committed, interesting, less committed in the sense that they express more positive attitudes towards divorcing if things don't work out. It's like, I used to be afraid of divorce and all this stuff. Now that I've been through one, I realize that if things get bad in this relationship, the answer is to bail out. And that's what she's talking about as far as commitment. There's plenty of other stories of people who, on their second marriage, ended up in a really different situation than their first marriage. By the way, Father Time is ticking. So maybe by the time you have your second marriage, you have already, ticked off another 5 or 10 years. So you're older, more mature, more understanding of what you really want, and so you find a partner that's better fit for you than your first time. And then of course there's the whole group of people that we talked about earlier about the serial relationships where, and I know some guys that are in my age group that have sworn off getting married again, ever. And some of them have kept to it. I know a guy who's got divorced probably 22, 23 years ago. He swore off never again. And he's sticking to it. I think he's going to go to his grave not ever having been married before. That's not the way I feel. I'm still optimistic, and I'm still thinking that I can have a long-term happy marriage with somebody, but I might be in the minority with my friends. My 2 closest friends here in El Paso, a man and a woman, both are single, and neither one of them is looking at getting married again. So I'm the outlier. I'm the one that thinks differently than that. So I would encourage you to look at the videos that I have posted. The Melanie Notkin video is pretty interesting. It's more expansive than the one we watched this morning. I think you'll enjoy it. She seems to be really energetic, and she's an attractive woman, so she certainly probably has had offers of marriage and just has declined it because she's looking for something more of a perfect fit for her. And at 51, that's still relatively young. You could live another 30 years probably, so you can have another 20 years of maybe good life together, decide to get married. The author also mentions, speaking of marriage, she talks about the U-shape aspect of happiness in marriage, that you're most happy in the beginning years of your marriage because of all that excitement and all that stuff that Sternberg talks about, the passion and all that. And then that wears off, and then you sometimes get into children and all these kinds of things. So their happiness in your marriage is not generally as great as it was in the beginning. It drops off, and then it keeps going down, and then it rises up later on in the relationship when maybe the kids are getting older and getting out of the house. And then when you're an empty nester, meaning no more kids in the house, it can rekindle your relationship that you had 20 years ago or longer when you first got married, and it was just the two of you. And now it's back to being the two of you, and you've got a lot of history together. You've raised 3 kids. You've lived in 2 different houses and 3 houses, and you've improved upon them. And you're at a financial time in your life where you're better off than you were in the beginning. So all these things can really help a relationship in this happiness. You can now, since the kids are gone, maybe you have more money disposable income, do the things that you've talked about, thought you were going to do, take a cruise or do these things that you were never able to do because you were working so hard to build your assets and send your kids to school and all those kinds of things. So that's the U shape that your author is talking about. There's some truth to that. And there's also truth that as your marriage is dropping down in the beginning of the U, that's when a lot of divorces occur because people say, this is not what I got married for. We used to be happy. Now we're blah, blah, blah. So it's time to get out of here. And then, like I said, a certain amount of people who do that, they don't get remarried. Maybe they're living with somebody, and then they end up in that situation of serial cohabitation where they're not married, but yet they live together, and sometimes that doesn't last, and then they end up going to live with somebody else. So marriage has taken a big hit. So as far as divorces go, we're probably at the same divorce rate that we usually are, which is no better than 50%. So literally 50% or more marriages fail. But what's more important is not as many people are getting married as they used to. So they're doing that serial cohabitation, and or they're just dating around like Melanie. I don't know whether she lived with anybody or not, but she's unmarried at 51. So, all right. Again, welcome back. Hope you had a relaxing holiday break, and we'll see you on Thursday. Okay, I got your message, Melanie. So at this, I'm going to shut the recording off, but I'll still stay on here.